Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We often get questions about some pretty fundamental stuff in education and how kids learn. And today we're going to tackle one of those big questions head on.
Yeah,
We're diving into gender differences when it comes to verbal performance in U.S. schools.
right.
I think a lot of people have a feeling that there are differences, but what does the research actually say? Luckily, we've got some really solid information to work with here.
Uh-huh.
A huge meta-analysis that looked at statewide assessments going all the way back to 2015.
Wow.
They published their findings in 2018, and this is really giving us a great snapshot of how boys and girls are doing when it comes to things like reading, writing, all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's a pretty comprehensive look.
So if you've ever wondered if there's a real difference, like something we can actually measure, in how boys and girls handle language, well, you're in for a treat.
Definitely some interesting stuff here.
We're going to break it all down, pull out the surprising bits, and hopefully give you some useful insights to take away. So to kick things off, this wasn't just some small study with a handful of kids.
No, not at all. This meta-analysis is impressive because they gathered data from 16 different states,
16.
which means we're talking about the performance of over 10 million students
Wow, that is huge.
from 3rd grade all the way up to 11th grade.
That's a pretty amazing scope.
Yeah, that's what makes this so powerful, especially when you compare it to older studies that, might have only looked at a few hundred kids or even less.
Right, this is giving us a much broader picture.
Exactly. The goal here is to get a really clear, accurate view of what's happening right now with these gender differences in verbal skills, at least as measured by these big state tests.
Makes sense.
So we're looking for patterns, trying to understand what those patterns tell us about how boys and girls are learning and using language.
So let's dive into those patterns, shall we? When they crunched all those numbers, from those millions of students and all those different assessments, what was the big headline? What jumped out at them about overall verbal performance?
Well, the primary finding, and this was statistically significant,
Okay.
was a small gender difference favoring females.
All right, so right off the bat, we see there's a difference.
And they measured this using something called Cohen's d, and in this case, it was 0.29.
Cohen's d. Now, I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with that, but for those who aren't, could you break that down for us? What does that number really mean?
Sure. So Cohen's d is essentially a way to measure the distance between the average scores of two groups.
Okay, in our case, boys and girls.
Right. And as a rule of thumb, a Cohen's d of around 0.2 is a small effect, 0.5 is a medium effect, 0.8 is a large effect.
So where does 0.29 fall?
0.29 puts us solidly in that small effect size range, but, and this is important, it was statistically significant, meaning that it's very unlikely this difference just happened by chance, especially with so many students involved.
Okay, so small difference, but a real difference. That's the takeaway there.
Right.
So how do we make that more concrete? 0.29, it's kind of abstract. Can we translate that into something a little more tangible?
Yeah, we can think of it in terms of what's called a common language effect size.
Okay.
So picture this. In terms of overall verbal performance, about 62% of girls score above the average score for boys.
Oh, wow.
That helps visualize it, right?
It does, yeah. 62%, that's more than half.
It is.
It's a noticeable difference.
It suggests a pretty consistent trend for girls to perform, just a bit better on average.
Now, we often hear about gender differences in other subjects, like math, for example. How does this verbal gap stack up against those differences?
That's a really good point. When we look at math, the gender differences are usually much smaller.
Small.
Sometimes they're practically non-existent.
Okay.
And in some areas of math, you might even see a slight advantage for males.
Interesting.
And what's really fascinating is when researchers look at this internationally, they see this kind of seesaw effect.
Seesaw effect.
Yeah. In countries where the gender gap in math is smaller, the gap in reading favoring girls is often larger, and vice versa.
So it's not as simple as saying, oh, boys are better at this, girls are better at that.
Right. It's much more nuanced than that.
It really depends on the subject, the country, all sorts of factors.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all answer here.
That's an important point. Now, this meta-analysis didn't just look at overall verbal performance, right?
No.
They broke things down by specific assessments,
They did.
like reading, writing, language arts. And I'm curious, did that female advantage hold up across the board?
That's where things get really interesting because we start to see some more distinct patterns depending on what skill is being assessed.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's start with reading. What did they find when they zeroed in on reading performance?
So for reading specifically, the female advantage was very small with a D of only 0.19.
0.19, that's even smaller than the overall 0.29.
Right, it is. This actually lines up with some previous meta-analyses. But it's a bit smaller than what we see in international assessments like PISA.
Yeah.
For the U.S., in PISA, the reading gap favoring girls was larger, around 0.26.
Interesting. Anything else notable about reading?
Yeah, this is pretty remarkable, actually. This very small female advantage in reading has been consistently found on the NAEP.
The NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, for those who don't speak acronym.
Right, the NAEP, and this trend has been going on every single year since they started collecting data way back in 1971.
Wow, 1971.
So it's been a very stable finding for a very long time.
That's incredible consistency over decades.
Oh.
All right, so reading. Tiny advantage for girls. Now, what about language arts? Or ELA, as it's often called.
Right, ELA. So ELA is usually a broader category. You're looking at reading comprehension, writing, grammar, vocabulary.
A whole mix of things.
Sometimes even speaking and listening get thrown in there.
So given that it's this kind of mixed bag, I'm guessing the results were a bit different?
Yeah, so because it's a composite measure, the female advantage in ELA was a bit bigger, with a D of 0.29, similar to the overall verbal performance finding.
Which makes sense because ELA kind of lumps reading and writing together.
Right, but the researchers did point out something interesting,
What's that?
that there's actually surprisingly little research that specifically focuses on gender differences in ELA.
Huh, that's unexpected.
Yeah, you'd think with such a common assessment there'd be more research dedicated to it.
Especially when we break down reading and writing separately.
Exactly.
So we've got reading, tiny advantage, ELA, small advantage, possibly driven by the writing component. Now, let's get to the writing itself. I think a lot of people have a hunch that the differences might be bigger there. What did the research reveal?
You're right on the money. The meta-analysis showed a moderate female advantage in writing performance with a Cohen's D of 0.45.
0.45, now we're talking, that's getting closer to a medium effect size.
Yeah, it's definitely more substantial than the gaps we saw in reading and ELA.
So what does 0.45 mean in real-world terms? Can you help us picture that difference?
Sure, if we use that binomial effect size display again,
Okay.
a D of 0.45 suggests that only about 39% of boys would reach a certain average level of writing proficiency compared to 61% of girls.
Oh, wow.
That's a pretty noticeable difference when you think about a classroom full of students.
It really highlights that writing is where the gap becomes more significant. Any thoughts on why writing stands out like this?
The researchers suggest it's probably because writing is a more complex skill.
More complex than just reading, for example.
It involves a lot of different verbal abilities working together, like vocabulary, spelling, grammar, sentence structure, and even the ability to organize your thoughts and express them fluently.
Right, it's not just decoding words on a page.
Exactly.
You're creating something new.
And we know that, on average, females tend to show small advantages in some of those individual components.
Like maybe they have a slightly larger vocabulary at a younger age or something.
Right. And when all those pieces come together in writing, those small advantages can add up, leading to a bigger overall difference in performance.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like a recipe with multiple ingredients.
Yeah, even small variations in those ingredients can change the final dish.
So those subtle differences in how those skills are applied, maybe girls are just a little bit ahead of the curve on average when it comes to putting all those writing pieces together.
That could be part of it.
Now, this study followed students all the way from grade 3 to grade 11. So that's a pretty long span.
It is.
Did these gender differences stay the same throughout those years?
Not exactly.
What did they see?
Well, they observed a trend in that overall gender difference, a linear trend.
Linear, so going in one direction.
Yeah, so it increased a little bit as students went from grade 3 up to grade 8, always favoring females.
So the gap widened a bit during elementary and middle school.
Exactly, and it seems like those are the years when the difference becomes more pronounced.
But what happened once they hit high school? Did that trend continue?
It's interesting, it seems to level off in high school.
It levels off.
It doesn't keep growing at the same rate.
So it peaks around middle school and then stays relatively stable.
Right, and this lines up with what we see in more specific areas too, like with reading.
Okay, so how so?
Well, data from the NAEP shows that gender gaps in reading are often smaller in those early elementary years,
Okay.
but then they get bigger in middle school.
So that same pattern.
And even internationally, data from PISA and PIRLS shows a similar widening as students get older.
So it's a pretty consistent developmental trajectory.
It seems to be.
Now, the study also mentioned this idea of achievement level. like whether a student is doing well overall or struggling, and how that might play into these gender gaps. What do they find there, particularly when it came to reading?
Yeah, this adds another layer of complexity.
Okay.
So for reading, they saw that from kindergarten through 8th grade, the gender differences were smaller among the high-achieving students.
Interesting. So among the kids who are excelling, the gap shrinks.
Right, but for the students who were struggling with reading in those same grades, the gender gap favoring girls was bigger.
Huh. So the opposite happens there. The gap widens.
Exactly.
Why do you think that is? Any theories?
The researchers pointed to the potential influence of, societal expectations.
Okay, so how we perceive boys and girls as readers might play a role.
Yeah, the thinking is that girls who are having a tough time with reading might actually benefit from the idea that girls are generally good at reading.
So they get more support, maybe, because of that perception.
Maybe, or maybe they're not as discouraged because they see other girls doing well.
But for boys, it might be the opposite.
Right, boys who struggle might be more negatively impacted by the stereotype that boys aren't as strong in reading.
So that stereotype could actually be a hindrance.
It might make them less engaged, less willing to put in the effort.
That's a pretty powerful example of how these broad social ideas can filter down and affect individual kids in the classroom.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Now, let's shift gears a bit. There's this idea that gets tossed around a lot, the idea of greater male variability. This notion that boys tend to have a wider range of scores in cognitive abilities. Look, you'll see more boys at both the very high end and the very low end.
Right, that's a common belief.
So what did this meta-analysis find when they looked at how spread out the verbal scores were for boys versus girls?
Well, this is important to clarify. Despite that common notion of greater male variability, this meta-analysis found a very small variance ratio, only 1.09 for verbal performance.
1.09, so basically 1.
Right. And this ratio tells us how spread out the scores are for boys compared to girls.
Okay.
And a ratio that's close to 1 means the spread is very similar between the two groups.
So in simple terms, there wasn't much difference in how much the scores varied for boys and girls.
No, not in this study.
So that kind of goes against what a lot of people might assume.
It does, and the researchers propose that what we're mainly seeing is a difference in average performance, not a difference in variability itself.
Okay, so the scores are clustered around different averages for boys and girls, but the spread is about the same.
Yeah, and they did note that boys are overrepresented at the lower end.
Like you said earlier, maybe more boys with reading difficulties.
Exactly, and girls tend to be overrepresented at the higher end, more girls in those advanced placement English courses.
More high achievers.
Right, so it's more of a shift in the center, the average, rather than a wider range overall for boys.
That makes sense. All right, so we've talked a lot about the patterns and the data, the what. Now let's get to the why. Why might these differences exist? The study mentioned a few possible explanations, right?
Yeah, but they stressed that the reasons are probably complex, involving biology, how our brains work, and of course, social factors all intertwined.
Makes sense. It's rarely a simple answer.
Right. So they talked about brain lateralization.
Which we've heard about in other contexts, right? Like how certain functions are dominant in one hemisphere of the brain versus the other.
Yeah, the theory is that prenatal hormones might influence how the two hemispheres develop differently in boys and girls.
And since the left hemisphere is often linked to language, that could explain some of the differences.
That's the idea.
But what did this meta-analysis conclude about that theory?
Well, they said that this study, and a lot of other research too, hasn't found strong, consistent evidence to support a direct link between brain lateralization and these gender differences in verbal skills.
So that's not necessarily the key factor.
Maybe not the main driver, no.
What about the fact that girls tend to go through puberty earlier than boys? Could that play a role in their verbal development?
That's another theory that's been explored, the idea being that earlier puberty in girls might lead to earlier development in some cognitive areas, including verbal skills.
And that could explain why we see the gap widen during those middle school years.
Right, it kind of fits with the timeline.
But is there strong evidence to support that?
Well, the researchers pointed out that the research connecting hormonal changes during puberty to specific cognitive abilities isn't as strong as you might think.
So it's still an open question, really.
It's a plausible hypothesis, but the evidence isn't definitive.
It seems like biology alone can't fully explain it. What about social factors? The study mentioned the role of sex roles.
Yes, and this is where some really interesting findings are emerging.
Like what?
Well, some newer research is suggesting that how much someone identifies with traditionally feminine or masculine traits might actually be a stronger predictor of certain language skills than their biological sex.
So it's not just about being male or female, but about the traits and behaviors we associate with each gender.
Exactly. And studies have found that people, both male and female, who identify with more feminine characteristics tend to do better on tasks related to grammar and language, regardless of their biological sex.
So a boy who enjoys reading and writing might actually develop those skills more than a girl who doesn't, even though we tend to think of those as feminine activities.
Right. And some research even suggests that biological sex might only influence verbal performance through these socially constructed sex roles.
Meaning,
Meaning that it's the way we raise boys and girls, the expectations we have, that might be the real driving force behind these differences.
so if we encourage boys to read more, to express themselves through writing without any stigma, those verbal gaps might narrow.
That's what this line of research is hinting at.
That's pretty powerful, and it offers a more optimistic view that we can actually change things.
Yes, by challenging those traditional gender roles, we can potentially create a more level playing field.
Now, taking a step back, even if these average differences are small, they can still have real-world consequences, right?
Absolutely. Even small differences, when they're consistent, can add up over time.
And the study pointed out that there might be an imbalance in how we support different groups of students.
Right, there's been so much focus, and rightfully so, on encouraging girls in STEM fields.
Science, technology, engineering, math,
Right, and we've seen some great progress there, but there hasn't been the same level of attention given to boys who might be struggling with reading and writing.
and those skills are essential for so many careers.
Yeah, verbal communication is crucial in almost every field.
So that difference in focus might be something we need to re-examine.
It's worth considering, for sure.
The good news is that the study also mentioned that there are effective interventions out there to help.
Yes, just like we have research-backed strategies for teaching math and science, there are also proven methods for improving communication skills in both boys and girls.
So the tools are there, we just need to make sure they're being used effectively.
Exactly, and that they're reaching the students who need them the most.
Now, as with any research, it's important to acknowledge the limitations. What were some of the caveats the researchers mentioned about this meta-analysis?
They pointed out a few things. First, while they had data from 16 states, a good sample size, those states might not perfectly represent the entire U.S. in terms of demographics, socioeconomic factors, or even how education is approached in different regions.
Right, each state has its own unique context.
And then there's the issue of standardized testing.
Oh, right, because different states use different tests.
Exactly. And those tests might not all measure reading or writing in exactly the same way.
So it makes it harder to compare apples to apples across the board.
It does. And they also mentioned that the data on writing specifically was a bit more limited, coming mostly from just 2 states.
So that's something to keep in mind when interpreting those writing results.
Definitely.
So to wrap things up, what are the main takeaways from our deep dive into gender differences in verbal performance? What should our listeners walk away remembering?
The big picture is this. This massive meta-analysis found a small but consistent trend of girls performing slightly better on verbal tasks.
A real difference, but not a huge chasm?
Right, but that overall difference hides some important variations, like the bigger gap we see in writing.
Which seems to emerge and grow most notably during those middle school years.
And interestingly, there wasn't much difference in the spread of scores, the variability between boys and girls.
Which challenges that common assumption of greater male variability.
Exactly. And even though we're talking about group averages, it's crucial to remember that individual variation is way bigger than any average difference between genders.
We can't just put people in boxes based on whether they're a boy or a girl.
Right. Focusing on gender can obscure the unique strengths and needs of each individual student.
So true. And that brings us to a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Given all these trends we've discussed, the small overall advantage for girls, the more significant writing gap, the developmental patterns, and the potential influence of societal expectations, what are the ways, subtle or obvious, that our culture and our schools might be shaping these differences in verbal performance?
It's a really important question to consider.
And what can we do actively to cultivate strong verbal skills and a love of language in all students, regardless of their gender.
Think about your own experiences, what you've seen in classrooms, even the messages we send in our broader society.
Food for thought, definitely.
It is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a really fascinating topic. We encourage you to explore more research on this if you're interested, and think about how these findings might apply to your own life and your community.
There's always more to discover.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep diving deep.
See you then.